All right, let's put this big red rubber ball in our mouth. Let's bite down. Let's memorize the safety word, and let's show War Thunder a little bit of self love because I've been pretty critical of the game lately. That's understandable. I think that overall, a lot of the changes that have been made for the sake of realism have been kind of detrimental to gameplay and been detrimental to balance. Now, thankfully, War Thunder is kind of moving along and actually trying to fix some things. We did get some new sim battle rating brackets, so we will have like a 13.0 bracket that will basically be kind of more or less the old meta with reduced multipathing. You'll still have top tier. It doesn't really solve everything. They also changed the radar warning receivers on a lot of planes, so they do pick up more of the radar. So, like the F-14A is not flying around blind to pulse Doppler radars. The F-4S is not going to be completely blind to pulse Doppler radars, and that means that Gaijin has made kind of an intelligent gameplay balancing decision of, hey, we're going to bump the F-14A up, but we're going to give it a little bit of a helping hand. Yes, it does undermine more realism, but it also improves gameplay, and that's one of the things that I want to focus on is gameplay. My channel is gameplay centric. I care about War Thunder as a game. I don't really care about it as a simulation, because as a simulation, it's kind of crap. Also, as a game, simulators are kind of crap. They're not fun. They're not really meant to be fun. They're not really meant to entertain your lizard brain. The thing that War Thunder actually does very well is being a game. One of the biggest shortcomings of other simulators is, one is like the barrier to entry, but two is just like really what you're focused on is the in the cockpit experience, and you're not really focused on the out of cockpit experience. You're not really focused on the balance of the game itself. The thing that War Thunder does well, and the thing that War Thunder does better than everything else, and what makes it an actual game, is the quality of the fights, the quality of the flight models themselves, the fact that everything across the board is generally speaking held to more or less the same standards of realism or unrealism. And there's a certain subset of the player base that wants to just increase realism across the board because they think that just making sim more realistic will make the game better, because the more realism there is, the better the gameplay is. And this only really applies in theory. And one of the trends that I've noticed amongst the realism lobby is basically once they get their changes and then realize that, oh, hey, the game's unbalanced, they don't play anymore. A lot of these players barely play the game as it is, so increasing realism, increasing the game and making it more like DCS isn't really going to pull players away from DCS, because War Thunder can't be DCS and War Thunder shouldn't be DCS. They fulfill two completely, entirely separate marketing niches. But because DCS is like this fucking gigantic Ouroboros of like content creation, where it's basically a game that people love talking about DCS more than they like to actually play it. And I think this is largely ends up being kind of the same with some of the War Thunder sim community as well. Anecdotally, I think Mythic Pi is maybe one of the funniest examples of a player advocating for realism and then having it come back to bite them in the ass. Basically what happened is he advocated for the removal of multipathing. He's been advocating for the removal of multipathing for like 2 years now. And basically with the 60-meter changes, he loads up about 3 to 4 games in Afghanistan with the Su-27, and then he's eating shit on his runway from yours truly, and he hasn't played the game since. Like, he got realism, and it turns out that adding more realism to the game didn't actually make it any better. And the reason it didn't improve gameplay is because realism has nothing to do with creating a balanced game. In fact, adding more realism to the game exacerbated the already underlying balanced issues. Planes like the Mirage 2000, the F-14A, went from being the best plane at 11.7 to being even better than they already were. The same thing goes for the F-16C, basically all of the US side, NATO side of the top tier thing. And it turns out that by and large, people do not like playing games that are fundamentally unbalanced. And War Thunder is a game, it is not a simulation. Yes, it has a simulation mode, but this game has been around for over a decade. This game goes all the way back to an Xbox 360 game. That game also had a simulation difficulty, and the simulation really was just more or less a control scheme and lack of markers. That's more or less the start and the stop of it. It wasn't a high fidelity sim, and War Thunder does not need to be a high fidelity sim. Those games already exist. Those games are already content creation monsters that don't run very well, i.e. DCS runs like crap. It runs like a game that was made in 1998. You can have the best computer in the world and try and get DCS to run correctly and stable and not be kind of a buggy mess will actually make you appreciate the spaghetti code buggy mess that is War Thunder. War Thunder, instead, what it's really good at is being War Thunder. That's really all it has to be. And it's not just the variety of vehicles. It's not just the different game modes. It's not just like, oh, well, there's this game, the tanks and the whatever and the naval stuff. War Thunder is good at being itself. There is enough in the game to do that you can kind of fluctuate around. You can find things to do. You can find ways to make the experience enjoyable. And the most enjoyable part of the War Thunder experience is kind of not just the ridiculous, like the large-scale part of it, because a lot of people want War Thunder to be like this all-encompassing, large-scale game, this compelling player versus environment experience mixed with naval, mixed with tanks. Like, if you ask anyone, they will theorize that War Thunder could be basically a higher fidelity version of like a very old game at this point, like Battle Stations Midway, where you have like an RTS element and you have like a naval element, you got a plane element, and we're going to throw in tanks, and maybe we'll throw in infantry, and it'll be like this all-encompassing thing. The asset stuff is there to do that, but that's not really where War Thunder shines. Because all of that stuff, the more you foister in on it, the more large-scale you make the game, the less intimate the experience is, and the less hashed out it is. Like, you can't really tell me that going into War Thunder and trying to strafe a convoy with an A-10 and getting immediately deleted by Saddam 25s is really all that engaging. Yeah, cool, it's a more realistic experience, but is it fun? And the answer is no, not really, because the AI, the AA, when you die to it, the way that you die to it, the feeling that you get from it, it feels like a gimmick. You can be flying at Mach 1, Mach 1.2 over a convoy, and it's Lee Harvey Oswald and Saddam 25 just yeets you out of the air, and you're just like, well, I guess I shouldn't have spawned. It's not really all that exciting. And the same thing goes with doing things like bombing the carrier. Bombing the carrier in something like the A-10, I've done it, is a lot of fun. It's fun to sink the damn boat. At the same time, the AA mechanic, not really fun. Not really, like, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like other single player games do, where yes, it might be hit scan, but it feels like the deaths that you get are earned in like the PvE environment, or that there's some kind of process to it. And War Thunder really has never hashed out kind of like its single player aspects. So it means that a lot of the game does feel kind of unfinished. At the same time, the part that is actually kind of sort of hashed out, and the reason I'm playing props again is because this is closer to what War Thunder was intended to be. War Thunder started as a World War II game with a couple of different game modes. It came out on Xbox 360. It actually kind of dates all the way back to the earlier IL-2 games, and I think then there was like a studio split or something like that. But this is one of the things that War Thunder does well. It does, being air Quake, being able to load into a plane, get into some action, fight a bunch of different things, a bunch of different, more interesting matchups, rather than this historical reenactment of like the Normandy invasion, this historical reenactment of the North African campaign. Like, I'm fighting Corsairs, G55Ss, Yak 3s in Tunisia, and I'm having fun. Like, this is legitimately entertaining. It doesn't mean that every plane in the game is necessarily good. Like, there's going to be difficulty in trying to achieve balance here and achieve something that's kind of interesting. At the same time, when it comes to World War II combat, when it comes to like being pretty damn interesting, I find this way more exciting than the DCS 109K4 module or the 190 module. Yeah, they're cool from the perspective of like clicking on things in the cockpit and getting into like the mindset I'm gonna like do a flight plan and do like the pilotage things. Like DCS does the pilotage things well. Like I can be entertained trying to air refuel in an F-16 for probably like 20 to 30 minutes at a time while drinking a beer. At the same time, I can't load into DCS and go out and get 8 to 10 kills in basically a 10 to 15 minute period. And I also can't find the same degree of opposition, the same degree of opponents, because in DCS, because so much is happening within the cockpit, that learning curve is just so much longer. It's so much more difficult to actually become like consistently proficient in it. At the same time, because War Thunder is doing kind of one thing really well, there's a lot of variety here. There's a lot of like pretty damn good opponents that if you do play like Prop Sim, you're going to eventually run into them. Like playing against Idaho Bookworm is a different experience than like playing against these guys. Like this is a game I went out, this is kind of like my most recent prop game that I recorded, and I was just doing this for kind of like aim practice. I picked a poopery match of like it's same planes on each side. So I have American Corsairs that I'm having to sort out from other American Corsairs and figuring out who's friendly, who's enemy. But at the same time, the density of combat, the time between engagements, it's much shorter, and I can chill. I can chill out, I can relax, and I can experiment with a bunch of different things. I get a Corsair here. Hey, cool, he's behind me. We're gonna just kind of roll through the punches, roll around a little bit, use our BFM experience to kind of hope that he shoots out in front of us. But like, this is legitimately, when War Thunder is fun, it's really fun. One of the biggest shortcomings, though, is because we only have kind of like effectively what amounts to one game mode in the form of Sim EC, and we don't have multiple playlists. Like, if you go back to the good old days of like Halo 3 being a thing, you had more than one thing to do. You could kind of change your game up based on, do you want to play a big team battle, you want to play a small team battle, you want to do 2v2s. Call of Duty also does this as well with like Search and Destroy is fundamentally a different game mode than just regular old team deathmatch. But it also means that with multiple playlists, multiple modes, you can kind of do multiple things. This is something that War Thunder doesn't do really well, because everything is centered around the grind, everything is centered around kind of getting to that reward screen, kind of satiating that ego. That's kind of how War Thunder tricks your brain into wanting to play it more. The cathartic ding of the kill feed makes the monkey brain go burr. Now, with all of that being said, am I really opposed to realistic changes? Like, no, not necessarily. Like, as long as they have the capability of adding to gameplay, of making the balance a little bit more equitable as well, though, you have to look at it from that perspective, because people aren't going to play your historically match-made NATO teams where you just spawn in and you stomp the living hell out of, like, the Russian team. Nobody's going to want to play the historically accurate ME-163 that you throttled up slightly too quickly, your 14-year-old pilot femboy twink just explodes or melts himself. Like, nobody wants to play that stuff. Like, very, very, very few people have the mental fortitude and desire to consistently play on a side of a game that is unbalanced. Games being unbalanced is fundamentally bad for gameplay. It's fundamentally bad for player retention. You can't really have a multiplayer game if you don't have multiple players. If you don't have players to fill out the other side, if you don't have an incentive to play on the other side, if you don't have some form of balance, then the game is not fun. And just adding realism to the game for the sake of realism to satisfy some kind of nebulous requirement for fidelity, it's ridiculous, it's stupid, and it's kind of advocating that War Thunder lean into its weaknesses instead of leaning into its strengths, because the strength of the game is the fact that it is played as a game. War Thunder doesn't need to become a babified version of DCS where realism is served for the sake of realism. People don't play this game for the ultra realistic gameplay. They play the game because it's a game. The way to improve War Thunder is to make it the best version of War Thunder that it can possibly be. And there's a lot of like very simple solutions. They do run into the exploitative free-to-play model, so we're not going to get a lot of like the solutions I would want. Like just the act of adding more than one kind of playlist to each mode, like adding a dedicated 1v1 sim mode or ARB mode, that would be an improvement. A 2v2 mode, a 4v4 mode, an 8v8. Different scopes and scales would go a long way towards improving and adding variety to the end user experience, because sometimes I do want to fight 1 versus 1. Sometimes having those smaller team battles is interesting, but it's not going to be persistently interesting. But just having the ability to change up the vibe would go a long way to making the game better without really having to fundamentally redesign everything. At the same time, yes, I would like to see like some kind of PvE mode where they can refine the environmental aspects to feel like they're not cheap, to feel like they're not like crappy fetch quests. But anyways, that's going to be pretty much that's the end of the video. I went out and Yak 3, damage model Goog, playing Goog. Gabe's actually still pretty Goog.